preferences? How do I support the clients that I have in promoting better self-regulation through sensory processing? So many questions. So I'm going to try my best to really give you a strong foundation in this webinar. We're so happy to be able to provide this for you. Thank you to David for supporting us in doing this and making it available for free. I know that there were so many people who wanted to dive deeper. So for those people, we will tell you that there is a masterclass that's being made available. We'll talk more about that later. But that is a way to dive deeper and something that we're excited about sharing with you guys as well. So without further ado, I will start sharing my screen. Thank you, David. Okay. So I really love when things are interactive. So I want to have your interaction on this. The tricky thing is that I cannot see the chat. So David will have to be the moderator and all the things right now. So I apologize if I don't respond directly to what you guys are saying. But when it comes to executive function or ADHD, there's so many different facets of it. Some of the biggest facets that I have heard that come up for so many people are self-regulation, the ability to focus, and the ability to concentrate. And as we think of that in terms of ADHD, there's only so much we can do. Those are all things that happen within the brain. It's not like we have a physical switch that we can just turn on and off. The interesting thing is there's so much overlap between sensory processing and ADHD and how those two come together, because sensory processing also influences our ability to self-regulate, our ability to focus, our ability to concentrate, and our ability to learn. And that intersection is what we're going to talk about tonight, because that's what I have found to be true with my own son, as well as the people that I've served in a coaching position as well. So we're going to talk more about that so that we can address tangibly certain ways to support and improve a person's ability to focus, to attend, to concentrate, and to self-regulate through regulation of sensory processing. So what we're going to do tonight is to see how senses affect self-regulation, behavior, focus, and attention. So I got this from Dr. Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry. He said there's a hierarchy of brain function, and our brains like to work from the bottom up. So if you look at it at this model, you can see sensory processing is on the bottom. And then there's emotions. And then on the top, there's executive function, logic, thinking, and learning. So this tells us that in order of priority, our brain is going to prioritize regulating sensory processing before it regulates emotions and before it regulates logic and executive function skills. So if emotions and executive function skills are off, one of the things that we can do, which is what we're talking about tonight, is regulate that sensory system so that the brain has the capacity to allow for more of those higher functioning skills to be taking place. So as this is the intersection between ADHD and sensory preferences. Now, before we go any further, I do want to say sensory processing. A lot of people have heard of it, but not everybody knows exactly what it means. Maybe you've heard of it in terms of a child with autism or somebody with sensory processing disorder and any kind of sensory processing difficulties. But the truth is, in short, the way a person processes the sensory information they're taking in throughout the day is considered sensory processing. So in that light, we're all doing it all the time. And the way that we interpret it determines our sensory preferences. I tend to use these two terms interchangeably, which isn't 100% right, and an occupational therapist will probably correct me, and you're more than welcome to correct me on this. But when I say sensory preferences, what I'm referring to is how we each individually interact or respond to different sensations in the environment and the effect it has on our ability to self-regulate and focus and concentrate. And each of our sensory preferences are unique. That's something that I really want to hone in on right away, because before we go any farther, I do want to really hone in on that, because it's important to understand that while you can get on Pinterest and see, 5 bajillion lists of sensory diet activities or sensory routines for a classroom or sensory this, sensory that, those can all be really great ideas. But unless you're meeting the specific preferences of the person that you're trying to help, they're all just fun activities. The moment that they become meaningful is when they meet the specific preferences of that particular person. So we all understand things best when we look at it through our own lens. So just take a minute, and I want you all to think and then type in the chat. Think of some sensations that really irritate you. They just drive you nuts. Maybe it's a certain smell. Maybe it's a specific sound or a specific texture, a specific, I don't know, some kind of sensation that really gets under your skin. Type that in the chat. And David, if you can say some of these out loud, that would be great.
We have wet socks.
Yes, that's a big one.
The mix of smells in the candle aisle. Nail scratching on the chalkboard. Oh, that one's. I want to write that one down too. Perfume. Chewing mouth noises. Loud crunching.
Those are mine too. Okay, so as you guys are typing in these irritations, I love it. Think of how you feel inside if you were to be placed in a room for 7 hours, just hypothetically speaking, 6 hours, 6.5 hours, where you had to be exposed to this particular sensation for the full 6 hours. What kind of feelings would come up? Let's talk a little bit about emotions and self-regulation while you're exposed to these irritations. What comes up for you? You can go ahead and type that in the chat.
We got anger, overwhelmed, fear. That's what was written. Irritation, unhappiness.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, just think of that chalkboard sound. That's all sorts of feelings.
Right.
Agitation, rage,
so much.
Yeah, wanting to leave.
Yes. Okay. So now imagine that you need to learn something super important. There's going to be a test on it tomorrow, and the only way that you can learn is in that situation where you're exposed to all of these things. How great is your focus going to be? How great is your attention going to be? How kind are you going to be to the person who's giving you this information? And what are you going to do when somebody comes up and taps you on the shoulder and says, you need to be more attentive? That's a lot of times what we see in classrooms, right? The kid who is labeled as maybe explosive or inattentive or never following directions or off task. A lot of times it can come back to these irritations affecting them so much that their brain isn't able to focus on those higher functioning skills. So let's take it a step farther in a different direction. Now think of a sensation that feels really calming to you. Again, maybe a certain smell, specific sound, or a texture. Go ahead and type that in the chat.
Weighted blanket.
Mm.
Ocean sounds. Sounds of waves.
I like that.
Lavender. Oh, that's mine, yes. A box fan. Warm water on my back.
Oh, interesting. I like that.
Yeah, a minky fleece.
So now,
Squeezes.
Yeah. What was that one?
Squeezes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good one.
My mom's perfume. That's nostalgic.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
So now imagine, that somebody comes in, and in the moment where you're super irritated, agitated, angry, aggressive, they come in with this calming sensation. The irritation goes away and this calming sensation comes in. Now, typically when I do this, I can see everybody's faces, and usually everybody's faces, you just kind of see an aura of calm. You can see people physically relax. This is the difference between being sensory regulated, our senses being regulated, or our senses being dysregulated. When they're dysregulated, our ability to self-regulate, our ability to focus, our ability to concentrate and learn, they're all just inaccessible, like we saw. When our sensory preferences are met, it's a completely different story. The person who is agitated and angry and aggressive because their sensory preferences are not being met can be completely the opposite when their preferences are being met. So this is a really empowering tool for people to be, for people to understand for so many different ways. Parents, teachers, childcare workers, so many people. So to help you understand a little bit more about this, I want to explain it in terms of an analogy, because that's the way that my brain works. So imagine that each of us has a series of 7 cups within us. And anybody who knows about the sensory system, you'll either be saying, wait, 7 senses? And then others might be saying, oh, there's more than 7. And you're both right. But these 7 senses are the ones that affect behavior and focus and concentration the most. So imagine we have a series of 7 cups within us, each one representing a particular sense. And each of our configurations of cups is different. So a small cup would represent a sense where you can only tolerate a little bit of that particular sensation. A big cup would represent an area where your body is seeking out more of this particular sensation. So now I want to take a minute and go through each of the 7 senses and talk and discover where these small and big cups are, so that you can see how they're affecting, how they could affect your self-regulation of focus and attention, as well as those around you. Just to keep in mind, a big cup that's empty will leave a person seeking more of that sensation. A small cup that's overflowing will lead a person to be avoiding that sensation. Either an empty cup or an overfilled cup will lead to dysregulation, which then blocks these things that we were talking about before. Our emotions are not able to be regulated. Our executive function skills are not able to be accessed. So this is why it's so important. So let's go into the vision sense really quick. As I'm doing this, I want you to tell us in the chat whether you have a small cup or a large cup in this sense for yourself. Somebody with a large cup might not mind clutter. Maybe they don't mind, or they seek out bright things. They have lots of different colors in their living space or in their office. Somebody with a small cup will be distracted by clutter, prefers mostly neutral colors, distracted by lots of movement or lots of light. They can get headaches or overstimulated by certain kinds of lights. So imagine a child in, let's say, a preschool class that has a small vision cup, and there's so many posters on the walls, and there's so many colors, and there's so many fun things. But that person, that child with a small vision cup, can be incredibly distracted and overwhelmed by that. And so it makes that environment not very conducive for them to be able to learn. So tell me, where are your cups here? Do you have a small cup or a large cup?
Yeah, we got a we have large cups and small cups across all the participants. So it's I think the small cups seem to be outweighing the large cups, but
okay,
that's just from the people that have responded in the chat.
Okay. So let's go to the auditory cup. A large cup would look like somebody who can tolerate noise, can block it out. They can tune out background noises. A small cup would be a person who can't handle a lot of noise. Unexpected noise might be startling or dysregulating. They can't tolerate loud. I do want to make a clarification here though. When a person has control over something, they can tolerate it. So a person can be loud, but not tolerate loud. Or they can have their TV up really loud, but not tolerate when somebody else's TV program is on really loud. And that would still indicate a small cup.
Yes, we yeah, Allison's given a small cup. Callie, we have Rosemary's given a small cup when I am not in control.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got Jen's given a medium cup, and we someone said super small.
Super small.
Said super small.
I love it.
So my son, so Wendy, my son has a loud voice,
mm-hmm.
but he may not necessarily, that may not translate in terms of a large cup.
Exactly. So he can be loud, but not necessarily be able to tolerate loud, because with him being able to control his voice, our brain, well, because his brain is more prepared for it, it can tolerate more of that. And because he's producing it, he can turn it off and on when he needs to. Whereas if somebody else was producing it, it would be less tolerable for sure.
Mm.
The other thing I will say that a lot of parents really resonate with, and a lot of teachers as well, stress tends to shrink cups. So while you might have a medium cup at the beginning of the day, your cup towards the end of the day might be about this big because stress shrinks cups. And the inverse is true as well. Being more calm and feeling supported tends to increase the capacity of our cups. So the touch or tactile sense, this has everything to do with the way things feel on our skin, on our body, and in our mouth. So somebody with a large cup, they can tolerate a lot of different textures. They like the feeling of things. They might have higher pain tolerance. Small cup, low pain tolerance. They'll overfeel things. So they're irritated by tags, seams, things feeling off. They can't tolerate unexpected touch, sensitive to temperature or textures. Where do we find ourselves with that one? This one also tends to be an area that causes some picky eating issues. So if your child ever gags on food or complains about the texture of food, it's likely a small tactile cup.
So yeah, Jessica, a lot of the participants have a large cup for this category. Jocelyn, Allison, LM.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
The taste cup, this one tends to be less intrusive when it comes to behavior or self-regulation. The people who see this affecting people most are parents whose kids have a hard time with food in general. So a large cup would be a child who, or a person who likes a lot of flavor, prefers more flavor, likes a variety of flavors. Small cup prefers mostly subtle flavors, can't tolerate too much spicy, salty, sweet, etc. Again, usually just something that comes up in a home setting. Yeah, so smell is something that comes up quite a bit in classrooms, in professional settings. This can be really dysregulating and is something that's often overlooked. A large cup would be somebody who likes to smell things. They're not bothered by smells as much. They can tolerate a lot of different things. A small cup would be sensitive to smells. They can't tolerate strong smells. I think I remember with the irritations, one of you said perfume, but then mom's perfume, I think, was also a calming sensation. So it's interesting to see how what could be a calming smell for the person who's in charge of the classroom, let's say, or the parent who's got all the candles going at home, could be really dysregulating to somebody else. I'm just going to keep going here. I think you guys have the
Wendy,
idea.
a quick question. Does it, what if it depends on the smell? I mean, that's kind of maybe a silly question when you think about, but in general, how would you evaluate that when it comes to your preference if it is dependent on the smell?
So I'm glad you asked that. In general, it kind of goes outside, well, it doesn't go outside of our cup analogy, but it'd be like you have micro cups within those cups. So let's say, for example, a food smell, you could have a small or a large cup for specific food or something like that. But what's happening is our brains, they store messages actually through our senses. And so if there's been a negative experience with a particular smell, the brain will always flag that as negative until it creates a different connection. So there will always be a small smell cup for that particular smell. Did I answer your question, David?
Yeah, it was great. It was Joni had phrased a response in a way that made me think that there was more to it that was helpful. Thank you.
Good. I love that you're keeping up with that chat. Thank you. So proprioception is one that is lesser known by some people, and it's a big word that really doesn't get thrown out a lot. But this one, it's impossible to have a small cup. You can have different things going on with proprioception, but for this, imagine either just a medium, large, or extra large. So proprioception has everything to do with the proprioceptive receptors are inside the joints throughout our body. So anytime there's pressure, pushing, pulling, or movement affecting any of those joints, it stimulates the proprioceptive sense and gives us proprioceptive stimulation. So the person who said, I like having a weighted blanket, or a hug or a squeeze. That's a person with a large or extra large proprioceptive cup. They're trying to feel that sensation of being squeezed or having pressure. And the proprioceptive sense is really interesting. We'll get into this in a minute because it tends to be very calming. So the way that we can get into trouble, or the way that you can see if a person has a really large proprioceptive cup, is if they are extra rough. They just don't know their own strength usually. They'll hug too tight. They'll give high fives too hard. They're breaking pencils. All of these things are getting that feedback, and it feels really good to their body, but it might not feel good to somebody else's body. So these tend to be the kids that get labeled again as overactive or hyperactive, which again really coincides with ADHD. And a lot of times it really is their body seeking out more proprioception. Were there any questions on that one?
No. And this would be the kid that would be labeled as aggressive, maybe?
Yep, exactly.
Maybe an unfair label.
Mm-hmm. Or the one who can't stop wiggling, or the one who's constantly kicking something, or just always moving. Absolutely. They just have a big proprioceptive cup that's always running low because they're sitting in a chair for 6.5 hours a day, or whatever that might be. Vestibular also has to do with movement. This has everything to do with your body being in motion. So anytime your head is tipping or tilting or flipping or spinning or in motion, that activates the vestibular sense. So a large cup would look like somebody who likes spinning, swinging, twirling, flipping, craves movement. A small vestibular cup would be somebody who might get motion sick. They fear or don't like swings or spinning. They also might have a fear of their feet being off the ground. It can come into play and cause a little bit of problem when it comes to potty training, for example. Having their feet off the ground and feeling really unstable is really fearful for a lot of kids with small vestibular cups. It goes into other things too, but that is the essence of that one. Any questions on that one?
No, just some affirmations around how this relates to their kids. Joni's commenting about how her daughter loves to spin and swinging.
Awesome.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Is there a connection between the proprioceptor and impulse control?
Ooh, let's see. I'm trying to think of an example. So what's happening, yes. What's happening is if our cups are empty, we don't have access to that impulse control like we would want to. It's going to go back to, let's go back to this. So if our sensory processing is not regulated, then impulse control, which is in that higher function, we just don't have access to it. So for example, the brain of the person who's seeking out more stimulation in any of these areas, all it's thinking is, I need to get access to this, or I need to get away from this. That's what our brain is wanting to do. Until our brain is satisfied with that, those higher functioning skills are not available to them. So for example, when you have a kid who's freaking out in the middle of a sensory meltdown, or really active or hyperactive, and you're trying to address them with logic, like, hey, it's not time to do that, we really need to get through this, or you're trying to address them through emotions, even validating their emotions, none of that will be very effective because their brain isn't there yet. It's still in that basic foundational portion of just regulating those senses. So hopefully this is all coming around to help you get a bigger picture of the tangible things around all of us that are affecting each of us at every moment of every day.
Hey, Wendy, quick question on that.
Yeah.
Can someone with a small cup in one area learn to like a big cup? And I don't know why, but I have the analogy of eat your vegetables at dinner time, you know, and the small cup battle, that old school parenting. And I was just wondering what your feedback was on, like, can you develop that large cup?
I love that you asked that. So sensory preferences can change. The beauty of it is that it goes with all that we know about the brain. The brain doesn't change very easily through force, and it doesn't change very easily when defenses are up. So if we try all of our, previous parenting tactics of forcing and pushing and prodding and bribing, all those things, it can actually have a negative effect on sensory preferences and sensory processing, improving our sensory processing. But that's exactly what a person will do inside an occupational therapist's office, for example. They'll go and have continued safe exposure to these sensations in a way that feels safe to the child and to their brain. And continued safe exposure creates a new neural connection. And so exactly, David, you're right. Those sensory preferences can change and those cups can expand over time. But it is a very intentional process and it doesn't come with force, for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So regulating tip number 1, these are going to be fairly general because I know we have parents of kids that are small and old and professionals of all different kinds. So regulating tip number 1 is prioritize proprioception, which is a bit of a tongue twister. But what this means is proprioception has the ability to calm and regulate most powerfully. One awesome thing that we do know about the sensory cups and the sensory processing system is that when we regulate one cup, it can help regulate the other cups. And because proprioception is so powerful, it's easiest to go for proprioception first. Also because nobody really has a small cup in the proprioceptive sense. So proprioception tends to be a positive thing for most people. So whenever you're wanting to add more self-regulation, help a child to focus more, help a child to concentrate more, or concentrate yourself, prioritize proprioception. Maybe that's going for a walk, going to the park for a minute or two, having an extra recess before a test, something like that, where they can get access to that movement or pressure before having to perform those higher functioning skills, higher level skills. Regulating tip number 2 is front load sensory regulation. And what I mean by this is that typically, if you were to look at a person's sensory system and say, okay, where are the small cups? You can typically also identify where during the day or what times during the day or what situations during the day are dysregulating. You know, for example, with my son, he had a really hard time in the grocery store, which is not the fantastic time for a kid to have a meltdown, right? It's not ideal. His cups were just like so overloaded every time we went into the grocery store. So what I started doing is before we went to the grocery store, I would give him a lot of sensory regulation. We would go to the park, he would get that proprioception. When he was going to get his hair cut, for example, that was a huge sensory overload experience for him. So again, we front loaded by prioritizing sensory regulation beforehand so that he could tolerate a little bit more for a little bit longer during something that we knew was dysregulating for him. And the third tip is start with sensory. There are so many different techniques and tactics and tips and tricks and all the things out there, and so many of them can be really great. Until we regulate the sensory system, though, a lot of these other ideas will not be as effective. Like I said, you can label emotions and validate emotions all day long, and that might not work as well until the sensory system is regulated. So when any of these things are off, when executive function skills are off, logic, thinking, learning, emotions, when any of these things are not in line with where a child wants to be or where you want them to be, start with sensory processing and regulate that first and see what naturally comes as a result of that sensory regulation. All of this to say, when we support our kids' sensory needs, we're supporting them physically, emotionally, and mentally so that they have the ability to do well. As I said before, there's a masterclass that I've created. If you wanted to find out more about the masterclass, you can scan this left side. The masterclass goes into tips for what you can do in a classroom, what you can do at home, what you can do before transitions, ways to really get into the nitty-gritty of how to support a child in very specific ways. It's self-paced, it's lifetime access, and if you're a professional, that's probably the best bet for you. If you're a parent and you're wanting more support in supporting your neurodiverse child, I would recommend going into the 2 Empower Club, which is where you get the masterclass free. And instead of $60 a month for the support within 2 Empower Parent Club, it's $50 a month using the code Sensory. You get weekly coaching, you get access to all the content that we have, and it's really a way to support you there. So that is it, but I am here for questions now. Now I'm going to get out of this and stop sharing my screen.
Wendy, that was a lot of information all at once, and I think you take a minute and you know, catch your breath.
Thank you.
I saw some audience members feverishly writing to keep up with what you're saying, but that was really amazing content. Thank you for sharing.
There is so much, and that's one of the reasons it's so hard to give everybody all the things in a 30-minute presentation. So I tried my best here to give you guys the foundations that will help you in whatever capacity you're in to be able to take this and go forward with it in a way that works for you. But I'm happy to give a few other examples. And I see some friendly faces in here. Hi, Joni. So good to see you. Okay.
So yeah, a couple questions. Are the little cups where sensory discrimination challenges might come into play?
So sensory discrimination kind of falls outside of this analogy. So not really. And that's where the analogy breaks down. Also within low registration, it doesn't really apply to the cups. It would almost be, if you were to use the cup, it would be like if the cup had a hole in it, then that's what low registration would be. So low registration is basically when you have a sensation and your brain is not processing the input from that sensation. So you're giving your child, for example, proprioceptive input, but it's never filling their cup or meeting their needs because they're just constantly letting it out as fast as you can and can put it in. And that's something that is most effectively addressed with a professional, an occupational therapist who's trained in that, because it's a pretty specific thing. But if you have a child in your home or in your class where you see no matter what you do, they don't seem to be satisfied, I would definitely look into low registration for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that detailed answer. So Jocelyn, you're here with us, and thank you for this question. Can you give an example of regulating step in order using a single example?
Absolutely. So one of my kids, when I taught special education, he was a first grader and he weighed about as much as I did. And so he was just the cutest. Oh, I loved this kid. He had a diagnosis of autism and was constantly off task and really he had a hard time task initiating and sticking with things and self-regulation. And his tendency was to bolt when any of that wasn't happening. And so literally the moment he got off the bus for years, from preschool until he got to us, the problem was he would get off the bus and just run because he was so dysregulated. And then anytime we got him in the class, it was always the challenge to keep this kid in the class. So once we learned about his sensory preferences, number one, we started prioritizing proprioception. So we taught him the value of what he called squeezies, which was one of his words that he loved using. And that was his way of telling us that his body needed more proprioception. And so he'd come off the bus, he'd get a big squeezy. We would do that regularly, and he stopped running, which was pretty amazing. The next thing that we would do before tasks that we knew that were going to dysregulate him, which for him was homework or tests, we would make sure he had some proprioceptive input. So before we gave this kid like a homework assignment, we'd either give him, like, we had rice bags, like you can put dried rice inside a sock, tie the end of it, and it acts as like a weighted object, kind of like the same concept of a weighted blanket. It's proprioceptive input while you're sitting down. So we would give him that. He could put it on his shoulders, he could put it on his lap, and it just gave him a little bit of calming proprioceptive input right before something that was dysregulating, so that he could function as much as possible through that task. And basically by doing those two things, we were prioritizing the sensory system over his emotions, because we had tried, you know, when he got off the bus, we had tried, Junior, it's so fun to see you. We're so happy to see you, like addressing all the emotions and making it, coming at it from that angle, and it just wasn't working. So we had to go directly to the sensory system and to the sensory dysregulation. Did that help, Jocelyn, or do you have a more specific question? That was helpful. Good. There's 5 bajillion different examples, I'm sure. So if something specific does come up, let me know.
So Wendy, Beth has a question, or she relates to your story of the grocery store. But what she was asking is sometimes her son would get more wound up if they went into the playground or the park beforehand, and she was really asking if that's, you know, what would you do in that case? You know, because that doesn't seem to really make him more available for a trip to the grocery store.
Totally. Hi, Beth, first of all. So you're right. So a lot of times too much stimulation can be dysregulating, which is not fun, because when the thing that you want to be regulating ends up being too much, because their brain is just like on fire, all this dopamine is just going crazy in their brain, it makes them not want to transition out of it. So what I would do, Beth, is I would choose something that's less exciting, less stimulating, but still meets those sensory needs. One of the things I used to do, so I'm huge on not going out and buying all the things, but just finding ways to integrate sensory regulation into what we're doing. So actually the vibration, if a kid is sitting in a cart, like in a grocery cart, and you go across the asphalt in the parking lot, that vibration is giving them proprioceptive and vestibular input. So it can be calming if they're seeking both of those things. If you have a child with a small vestibular cup, don't do it. If you have a child that seeks that vestibular input, go for it. Take a little extra spin around that parking lot, because it's calming them, it's regulating them, and it's really helping to give them a little bit of extra so that they can tolerate the grocery store a little more. The other thing that I like to do is, just like David was asking, can these cups change and can the preferences change? Yes, with small microdoses, with support while they're calm. So what I would probably do, take mini trips to the grocery store, not for anything important, but just for the sole purpose of teaching him that he can tolerate the grocery store in microdoses until he can tolerate a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Okay. It's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Any specific recommendations for front-loading sensory regulation before bedtime?
Yes. And again, this will depend on your kid and your routine. A lot of people like to do bath before bedtime, and that's a fantastic way to do it. So if you imagine some of the things that we talked about, some of the things that you all had mentioned actually before this was certain smells feel really calming. So if you have a child with a big smell cup who's calmed by lavender, for example, put them in a bath with some lavender in it. That baths can be really regulating and really calming. Movement can be really calming. The thing with movement, you have to be a little bit careful, because movement can, well, anything can be calming or alerting, any kind of sensory activity. Calming tends to be rhythmic and slow and deep pressure. Alerting tends to be more sporadic and faster, and still can be deep pressure. So for example, running, like Beth was talking about at the playground, can be really alerting for a child. It's filling their proprioceptive cup, but it's also really alerting. Whereas hanging from the monkey bars, great proprioception, but it can be more calming. So just understanding which types of things are calming your child and which are alerting your child, and putting in more of those calming things. It might be as simple as sitting with them on your lap and rocking while you're reading them a story. It might be having a little dance party where it's soft and slow and rhythmic. That movement can be really calming, but it could be really alerting too, depending on your child. And yes, a bath can be proprioceptive as well.
Can you repeat that again, Wendy, about which ones are calming and which ones are alerting?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Calming tends to be slow and rhythmic. And there was another one. slow, rhythmic. Oh, and the deep pressure. And fast would be more sporadic. So if you can just imagine two types of dance, right? More like free flow, fast dance, that can be alerting, which would be great after school before homework when you want your child's brain to be more alerted. Not so great right before bedtime. Bedtime would be more like dance, like ballet, slow, like that. Okay.
What do you mean by deep pressure? I'm confused about that.
So deep pressure can be anything that is pressure to any of the joints in the body. So some children, some people, I mean, good heavens, my husband has a really big proprioceptive cup. So maybe you guys can relate to some of this. He likes to always put his feet underneath my butt when we're sitting down together because the pressure on his feet is really calming to him. So a lot of people will do that. Or my 10-year-old actually has a really big proprioceptive cup. So he likes to be sat on because that's deep pressure to his whole body. He loves wrestling, all those things. It feels so good to him. So deep pressure can be anything like that. It can also be pulling on your joints. Like I was saying, hanging from the monkey bars. It's really activating to those proprioceptive receptors in the shoulder. Deep pressure could also be like a little massage or like a weighted blanket or being really squished on a beanbag or anything like that. I don't know. There's a lot of examples, so I'm trying to give you a huge variety of them. Does that answer your question at all, Megan?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah, the third step was start with sensory.
There's a couple last questions. Maybe we can wrap up with these. I know Jen has her hand up, but so Andrea and Kathleen are asking about the masterclass and the age group that it's geared towards. Is it for school age children or preschool or both?
Yes. Sorry, I'm writing the steps in the chat so you guys have those. Okay. Yes, I'm gearing it to all age groups as best as I can. The way I'm doing it is through different examples. So what I'll do is I have a series of 5 to 10 minute videos that are going in different sections. And so it's literally right now it says sensory at school. So what I'll do is I'll give you the foundations of supporting a child's sensory preferences in a school setting. And then from there, I have different resources saying 0 to 5, for example, like preschool, elementary school, and older. And I'll give you a bunch of examples of what that might look like to support those sensory preferences in those different age groups. So my hope is to give you ideas on how to do that in a way that works for you, knowing that obviously a quick Pinterest search will give you a lot of ideas, but we want to go, I like to go beyond ideas and to what actually is going to work for you and how can you implement it in a way that doesn't feel like you're constantly being a therapist. I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, that's a very helpful description, Wendy. Thank you for that. I have a question for you that, I mean, I love that Audrey's asking this. My son gets really disturbed by the constant buzz in the classroom. I mean, who doesn't? But obviously, you're talking small cup here. Any suggestions?
That's a tough one. So the only thing you can, so our options when we have a small sensory cup is either move away from the sensation or find a way to regulate yourself so the sensation doesn't bother you as much. And in a classroom situation, you can't minimize or move away from that sensation other than noise canceling headphones, which you can't have all the time. So the other option would be, how can we regulate his other cups so that he can better tolerate that? Or how can we give him a break periodically so that he can tolerate that? So that might be, you know, during tests, he has a little break, or right before tests, he has a little break, because you can't take him away from it. Did that answer your question, David?
Yeah, I think so. Or at least for Audrey's sake, or her son's sake.
Yeah.
Lucia has a question. I'm sure her hand is raised, so I wasn't sure if she wanted to ask a question, but Yeah, that kind of wraps up our presentation, Wendy, for the most part. We've had some diehards hanging in there to the very end, so thank you very much for your time tonight.
Oh, Jocelyn had one more question. Do you mind if I answer that one last question since it?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, scroll down to the bottom.
All right. Okay, let me answer this one. I'm glad you asked it. So what I meant with start with sensory is that when you see emotional dysregulation or lack of focus or any of those things that were on the top of the triangle, actually, I can send a copy of the PowerPoint to you guys after this. Would that be helpful? Okay, I'll do that. Keep an eye out for an email after that. But when you're seeing any of those things lacking, instead of addressing those directly, go to sensory processing first and try to regulate the sensations, try to regulate those small cups that might be overflowing or fill up those big cups that you know your child has, and see if those other things automatically regulate themselves. And if they don't, you'll at least know that your child's brain is able to process those other things and able to focus on those other things. Does that make sense? It's like you're raising the capacity of the brain by regulating that sensory system first, and allowing them to do the other things. Absolutely. Cool. Yes, I will definitely send the keynote to you guys. Okay. Thank you, David. That's it.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your time tonight. We'll take the recording and share it out. And if anybody has any follow-up questions that we haven't been able to answer, you can reach us via email through multiple means. I can put an email here if that's helpful, but you can do David Murphy at Effective Effort Consulting or Wendy as well. So I'll put them both in there.
Perfect. Oh, good luck with mine. Do you have it, David? Okay. Thanks so much for showing up, everybody. We hope this was really helpful to give you some tools to start and start regulating those sensory systems so they can self-regulate and focus and pay attention.